Hi, welcome, Gama Perruci. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. And we are at the International Leadership Association conference. Gama is one of the founding members of the International Leadership Association. Is that right?
Well, I'm the first chair of the board of directors when the International Leadership Association became a 501c3 organization.
Tell us a little bit about your book that you're a co-author of.
Sure. The title of the book is Understanding Leadership in Arts and Humanities Perspective. It was published by Routledge, but with my co-author, Robert McManus. The main emphasis of the book is to understand leadership. It's not just to talk about the leader. And I think in a way the field still is struggling to move away from too much emphasis on what leaders do and that personality cult. And in the book, we emphasize 4 other components that we need to pay attention to. So, for instance, we also pay close attention to followership, big importance of followers.
Can you give a little more information about what followers are and how do I, as a leader, inspire followership?
Oh, certainly. The importance here is that we see, especially through technology and communication,
Hmm.
how followers are becoming mobilized and
Hmm.
developing their own voice and very powerfully, particularly in the area of politics. We see the Arab Spring, the
Hmm.
different movements. The only thing that you see is that with these kinds of movements, whenever you don't have leaders working with followers, these movements don't tend to be as successful, which is an interesting area for research. A lot of the Arab Spring movements just took off, but then disappeared and were not as effective. So that's the one other component. And the other one is the emphasis on the goal. To what extent leaders and followers agree on a common goal.
So the Arab Spring, how would that have looked if there were a common goal and leaders? Because it seemed like the groundswell was what made it so powerful.
It made powerful but not lasting.
Okay.
It did not produce. You could make the distinction between the French Revolution and the American Revolution, that the American Revolution had a clear delineation in terms of leaders and then followers. But then the French Revolution, and in the beginning, that it did not have clear leaders and the followers rose. And that is to say that this phenomenon of followership is not
Hmm.
new. Arab Spring is not new. The French Revolution
Hmm.
was, in fact, very similar. But it became so violent, so it did not produce in the short run the kinds of changes that they were hoping. Now, eventually, with the advent of the
Hmm.
republics, and that
Hmm.
it had a positive outcome. But the third item that we talk about, so you have leaders, followers, goals. A lot of our discussion about leadership today only has these 3 components. They say, well, leaders work with followers and they achieve goals. That's it.
And yet this all happens in the context.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So it is also important to factor in the contextual place where that relationship between leaders and followers
Mhm.
take place. It does not take place in a vacuum.
So leadership in the Arab Spring would look different than leadership in the French Revolution.
Exactly. Well, in all other revolutions
Hmm.
to come. This context also defines the kind of leadership style that someone would take on. So,
Hmm.
for instance, well, we say that in the new century, that leadership should be more participative, more flat organization, which is
Hmm.
fine. But then let's put a different context. The building is on fire.
We still need the capacity to do the old out the building,
Command
that
and
door,
control.
that way.
Right. So to recognize that. Now, I'm
Hmm.
not saying that it should be always command and control.
But there's a balance, and
Exactly.
it's knowing when to use which skill most
Mhm.
effectively.
And that requires a lot of, for the leader, not just self awareness, but also awareness of the context.
This is one of the areas I think people, when they hear this inclusive leadership, they're afraid that that means that they're not really leading. And what I hear you saying is, in fact, I may lead differently when I'm being inclusive, but I also have to have the capacity to do all types of leadership and know based on the situation which one goes when.
Yes,
So skills have to be more.
exactly. Now, that can be quite challenging for a leader because you may not have all those skill sets. And it may come to that time when you have to delegate, where you say, I do not have the skill set to deal with this kind of context, so somebody else can come in.
So either delegation or even co-leadership, right?
Yes. Or stepping aside
Hmm.
and letting somebody else step in and you're not.
And yet some leaders are not very excited about that.
Exactly. In a way, that's where power, then the issue
Mhm.
of power comes in. I think that the challenge for the leadership field is to recognize that it's not one or the other.
Again, it's a continuum, and I need to know which, and to your point, some are gonna feel more comfortable, but how do I strengthen my capacity across the range and from a leadership development perspective?
You said it beautifully. And that is exactly in terms of leadership development, what we should be doing is to enhance and expand that capacity. What I'm afraid is, and I'm going to be unorthodox here, but that's okay, that I think right now the sexy thing is to say participatory and put a lot of emphasis and then somehow if you take on a more command and control during a time when the context calls for that, that somehow you're not a good leader.
I think that's a brilliant point because, yeah, our society has now made it sexy to be participatory.
Mhm.
And yet I can think of times where that's really a bad call. I was working in an organization that was in receivership. This was not the time to get input. This was the time to fix the problem.
Yeah,
And that took very decisive and unpopular action because otherwise the enterprise would be no longer. And then no one gets the benefit of anything.
exactly, exactly. So now the fifth component. So we talked about leaders working together with followers toward moving toward goals in a context. But then a circle around all of that is the cultural context. So it's not just the environmental or the organizational context, but there are certain values and norms that guide that relationship.
So when you talk about values and norms, I know what those words mean. Are you talking about the organization's culture, the societal culture, my industry's culture,
No.
global culture?
Well, the societal, you have the societal culture in
Mhm.
terms of the way that a society holds certain collective norms. But then you also have the global dynamic where different societies have different norms.
Mhm.
Now, what's so challenging for leadership today with globalization is that now you have leaders and followers who may have different values, but they still have to work together.
Most likely do.
Exactly.
Either the leader being on one continent and followers being global
Exactly.
or different ages. Lots of variations where I might have different values than the person walking
Exactly.
next to me.
So, for instance, this is a personal story that I was born and grew up in Brazil. I grew up in this American Southern Baptist community. They had developed this seminary. My parents, who were Brazilian, they taught in that seminary. And so, growing up as a kid, I would play with the American missionaries' kids.
Mhm.
But when the parents, the missionaries, would not allow the Brazilian kids to go in their homes. So when the kids, if we had something, and said, "Oh, the missionary kid I have a toy that I
Mhm.
want to get for us to play," so we would come in. I would have to stand at the door.
Why?
That always puzzled me, and I never. Two possibilities. One is trust, lack of trust. They thought, okay, these kids, can I trust them to come in? Are they going to steal something? Or are they beneath that they cannot go in because this is their.
Neither one of those are positive.
No,
How did that impact you? And I know we're talking about global culture, and yet here's an artifact of something that you're still telling it more than 5 years later, means you've
way
carried this
more than
for
5 years later. But I think I carry this with me as an example of
Mhm,
how, when different cultures collide, you have all kinds of a dynamic of
mhm.
power, the impact that it has on different people.
I'm just imagining a totally different story.
Okay.
You come to my front door. I hadn't been expecting a guest. I don't invite you in because my crazy uncle's in the back room and he has Alzheimer's and may not be dressed. It has nothing to do with discounting you.
Oh, okay.
So it's also curious that something happens and we make sense of it based on our view of the world. And we carry that forward and it
So maybe we
extends.
need to put another circle around the others, the role of perception. No, I mentioned the example just to
Mhm,
illustrate that now more and more we have to deal with that component
mhm,
of cross-cultural literacy,
mhm,
competencies. But there's also another one that I call the global leader. And that's a leader who is not necessarily representing a single culture,
mhm.
but it's a leader who can transcend. So, someone who is comfortable in many different cultures.
Okay, so I'm curious because I was a co-author on a global leader book,
Yeah.
and I think what you're saying is different than what we talked about. And it seems very exciting to me. So we talked about a leader who hails from a country, so from the
Yeah.
US, and then I go learn about these other cultures.
Yes.
Are you talking about someone who identifies as cross-cultural more than American or Brazilian or European?
Right. No, I think in this century, it's that next level of a leader.
So I see my tribe as the global community.
Yes, but I'm not talking
Excellent.
about the world citizen
Okay.
movement, but a way that a leader can develop his or her own identity and be comfortable in different settings. So, for instance,
Mhm.
right now, if I go to Brazil, then people say, "Oh, you have lived in the United States for over 30 years."
In Ohio, no less.
No, I mean, just 17 years.
Okay.
But no, it's Texas, Florida, Alabama. So,
You
uh,
haven't done New York and California
no,
and
I know I need to go out west. But when I go back to Brazil, they say, "Oh, you're an American." But when I'm here, then people say, "Oh, you're Brazilian." So my tendency is to say, "Well, I'm Gama."
I've worked globally, but my residence has been predominantly in the US, so I haven't worked as an expat. How, if I don't reside in a country other than where I grew up, do I develop that capability? I mean, you've had the opportunity to really develop a dual citizenship in your essence.
Exactly. You don't go to school and you go take a class.
I teach a class and nobody walks out feeling like they're a global leader. Hopefully, they are more global, but 7 weeks not enough to do what took you 30 years to do.
Exactly. No, you develop that over time. You also have that opportunity to pick up pieces here and there. So,
Mhm,
in terms of my family history, so the last name is Perrucci.
mhm.
So, an Italian family. But my brother, he lives in France. He's
Okay.
a Italian citizen, but I have family in Brazil. So it's the way that you just weave that different. And
So multi-continental.
exactly.
Okay.
Now, and just to add one more point about what I find exciting about the International Leadership Association, to kind of bring us all back to
Mhm.
the ILA, is that it gives you that space for all of these different leaders. to come together
Mhm.
and share these stories, share these experiences.
If one of our listeners is interested in becoming more global, so we have listeners from 66 countries and they can't all get to Atlanta or Brussels or Barcelona, what's the next first step?
I'd like to turn this around and say you don't have a choice. It's not a question of saying, how do I become more global? We are becoming more global. Individuals,
Okay.
we don't have a choice. I think globalization is just shrinking the world to
Mm.
such an extent that even in Marietta, I see that. Now, there's nobody else there from Brazil that I've met, but there is cultural richness, different people who are exposed to all kinds of different cultural norms. It's a small town of 14,000, great town in Ohio, but I feel at home.
We do have people who are just rejecting
Oh,
globalization.
sure,
And so I'm
sure.
I'm wanting to speak to that idea that to be a healthy economic system, no matter which continent one resides within, it's important to acknowledge that we are part of a global economic structure.
Oh, definitely.
And as we're leading, the enterprises we lead will be much more successful if we embrace that global identity rather than rejecting it.
Especially for a simply utilitarian purpose that you reach more customers and it's a wider market. But there are some leaders who try to take advantage of some of these fears
Mhm.
and make a name for himself or herself to stoke that kind of fear in people.
And I'm wanting to respond to that in a non-political way, very respectfully. When we offshore jobs, people do lose their jobs here. And that's a reality.
Well, they may lose one kind of job, but they may gain another kind of job.
And in fact, in Ohio, where we both reside, we have a huge market where companies like Honda manufacture. So we do have a lot of jobs created because of globalization. It's
Right.
not that everyone's been outsourced and we're left with a donut in the middle.
Exactly.
But I guess I'm speaking to people who may be concerned that as we globalize, they could lose.
Oh, sure, sure. No, no. And I don't mean to minimize
Mhm.
that if you are 50 years old and then you lose your job,
Mhm.
what are the chances of going back to school and getting the
It's scary,
retraining? It is very
especially
scary.
when you want to
Yeah,
support your family and do
exactly,
yourself.
exactly. No, and I don't want to minimize that, but at the same time, you don't hold back industries simply
Mhm.
because you're trying to protect. So then that's a recipe for economic stagnation, ultimately economic failure.
So it sounds like what we need is a more comprehensive approach to globalization.
Oh, definitely.
Thank you, Gowan. This has been just a delight. I
Oh, glad to do it.
appreciate your wisdom.
You're welcome. Thank you.